whether you don't have health care, you've ever been on hard times and you needed food assistance or you needed unemployment insurance to come through, lawmakers need to hear those stories. They're hearing too often from corporate lobbyists and business interests.
We have on the line Robyn Hyden now. Robyn Hyden is the executive director for Alabama Arise, a nonprofit advocacy organization and coalition fighting for Alabama's poor and working people in Montgomery. We should also say, probably for, journalistic integrity, that Adam is an employee at Alabama Arise. He is the Northeast Alabama organizer, and I am a member of Alabama Arise, as is our Labor Council. So we are very appreciative of Alabama Arise here on the Valley Labor Report. We think they do some great work, and we're really excited to welcome Robyn to the program. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.
It's so good to be with you. Thanks for having me. And I'm so grateful to have you as an Arise member. As you know, Arise members set our legislative agenda. So we view ourselves as lobbyists for poor and working people here in Montgomery and across the state.
So yeah, let's pick up from there. Explain to folks who maybe aren't familiar, remind us what and who is Alabama Arise.
Sure. So Alabama Arise is a coalition of 150 plus member organizations and thousands of individuals. We're united in our belief that people in poverty and working class people are struggling because of decisions made in Montgomery. Alabama concentrates so much power and authority in our state legislature. And we believe the solution to that is having everyday working folks involved in setting state policy. So we go to you, our members, and folks across the state to say, what do you need to happen in your communities to shift power back to poor and working people to make life easier? We've been doing this now for over, I think, 38 years. And, one of the things I love about Arise is that we're not beholden to big business interest or corporate interest. We're beholden to regular people. So our members set our agenda, which includes, equitable taxes. We've worked to reduce the state grocery tax. We believe that too many low-income folks bear the burden of paying for state services through really high sales taxes. We work on things like adequate funding for education and human services, things like expanding Medicaid, funding for safety net programs like food stamps and unemployment insurance. And then we work on things like criminal justice reform. We shouldn't be paying for state services through fines and fees for people who can't afford them. We work on voting rights expansion and maternal and infant health. So we have a broad agenda, but the bottom line is that we think state policy is better when everyday people are involved in setting the agenda.
Right. And, before we get into 2025 and look ahead to the next legislative session, I wanted to just kind of take a step back and review some of the highlights and the lowlights of the 2024 legislative session. I would argue that there were many pieces of legislation where everyday people did not have our input involved, not adequately. But could you tell us some of the things that really happened this year, both good and bad, coming out of the legislative session?
Yeah, I'll be honest, I missed a lot of the session because I was on maternity leave this year. But
That's right.
Our stuff like Adam and our lobbying team, our policy team, and our organizers were working really hard to make sure that we moved our agenda forward. So there were some good news. Alabama became one of only a few states in the South to fund summer EBT, which is SNAP or food stamp benefits for school children. So Alabama had opted out of this program in 2024, and next year we will see those benefits restored to over 500,000 children. That's huge in terms of addressing childhood hunger and helping working families get through those summer months when they don't have school meals to lean on. In some more good news, we worked with a coalition of labor, and community advocates to speak out against child labor. There was a bad bill that passed that made it easier for employers to hire minors without, informing the school. But there was also a bill that passed to increase penalties for corporations that benefit from child labor. Um, we saw some legislation to advance paid leave for state employees move forward, and we're really hopeful that next year we're going to be able to come back and get paid maternity and parental leave for those state employees, some of whom, are doing really essential, thankless jobs. We believe that the best way to improve maternal health and child health is to make sure that parents have time off after they welcome a new child into the family. Um, so it was a mixed session. I like to focus on the positives. I will say we defeated about 80% plus of all of the bad bills that we were opposing. And in a state like Alabama, that's good news. It's easier to kill something bad than it is to pass something good. But we had to work really hard to educate lawmakers about the harm that these bills would do. There was a pretty bad bill to limit absentee voting and assisting in absentee voting. So we have some work to do to mitigate the harm of that and to educate people about the rights that they do have. But there was a bill to help inform people that their rights have been restored when they get out of prison, that we, moved pretty far along. So as always, you've got to focus on, the progress that you can make. In a state like Alabama, sometimes it can take 4 to 5 years to really move good policy. And we try to celebrate every progress, every piece of progress that we can.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, it's easy to get pretty disenchanted when you look back at some of the legislation that was passed this year, whether it's, yeah, the absentee ballot bill that you mentioned, or the attacks on diversity, or, of course, SB 231, which was an attack on labor unions. So there, there was a lot of bad news coming, but I appreciate you highlighting some of the positive stories, which tells us that even in a state like Alabama, where those of us who are concerned about poor and working class people are often, on the outside looking in when it comes to those in power in Montgomery. But even in those dynamics, with enough pressure from everyday people, we are able to make some progress, right? Whether it's defeating bad bills or pushing good ones. And I think the fact that 500,000 children will have more food to eat this summer, that is a big deal. It shouldn't have been that hard. We shouldn't have to fight that hard to feed hungry children in this state. But the fact is, we were able to help push through that, and that's really, a big victory. So we're hoping to look ahead to that. And you mentioned the 2025 agenda already a little bit, but could you just remind us, where does that come from? Talk to us a little bit about the annual meeting and kind of that process. How is the agenda formulated?
Yeah, so my favorite thing about Alabama Arise is that we don't have a panel of experts who sit in a room and just come up with policy. We actually think that experts are everyday people in our membership and in communities. So every summer we go out, our organizers like you do listening sessions with our community partners, and those listening sessions are just conversations. They're popular education conversations where we say, what are you seeing? What are you hearing? What is working or not working in your efforts to make your community better? And out of those listening sessions, groups will propose policy solutions that they want us to work on. So we have an issue proposal process where if you become a member group of Arise, you can propose a piece of legislation that you would like to see us endorse and add to our agenda. And when we endorse that, that means you get the support not just of your local group, but you have thousands of people across the state working to support this bill with you. And we have a full-time lobbyist, we have, policy analysts, we have comm staff, all of whom we're going to be working to advance legislation. So when a member group proposes legislation, they bring it to our annual meeting, which happens every September. And anyone who's a member of Arise can attend that meeting, uh, hear out what the proposals are, and then vote to rank them on our agenda and essentially say, hey, how should we prioritize our work? We're never going to be able to advance on all fronts. We're never going to be able to move every policy that we would like to see every year, but our members help us prioritize what they think is most urgent and critical. So for years now, our members have said, number one, we want you to expand Medicaid, and we have put a lot of time and energy into pushing a coalition called Cover Alabama, pulling together to, bring any allies in we can to advocate for that policy. Our members are the ones who said, we want you to focus on untaxing groceries. That was not some national group that came in and said this should be the policy solution. And it was our members who said, we really think voting rights are a critical piece of power. You can't address poverty without addressing power. Power is, determines everything. So I would encourage folks who've never really gotten involved in state policy or politics. It can feel really discouraging. I think often my entry, at least into activism and advocacy, was I was very focused on the national policy landscape. And the reality is that so much of policy is enacted at the local and state level. So regardless of what Congress is doing or what our president is doing, it's Alabama lawmakers and people we have much more direct access to, who really have a say in what gets enacted or what gets stopped at the local level. I first got involved at Arise as a young, AmeriCorps Vista, and I was working for these nonprofits that were, doing direct services in the Birmingham area. And what I found at Arise was I, as a regular person who didn't know anything about state politics or the legislature, could come in, get an overview of what was happening, and really figure out how I could make a difference. We're not partisan. So, it's not, obviously elections matter, and we all have to participate in making our electoral system better and more reflective of our communities. But we come in and say, okay, now these are the people representing us. How are we going to hold them accountable? One thing that's fascinating about doing this work in Alabama too is a tactic that the right has used very successfully in defunding government is that our government, our legislature, has almost no staff. When you go lobby in Montgomery, you might be surprised to find you have direct access to your legislator. You call them up and they're the one answering their own phone, because our House members don't have staff. Our senators have one staff member. And so they are relying on lobbyists and everyday citizens to educate them. They're reviewing thousands and thousands of bills every year. And that actually gives you more power than you would think that you have to influence the process, believe it or not. So we take advantage of that. We say if they don't have staff, we will be the ones to go in and educate them about these issues. And who better to do that than regular everyday people who've experienced these things? So whether you're someone who's struggled because you don't have health care, you've ever been on hard times and you needed food assistance or you needed unemployment insurance to come through and you found it wasn't quite there for you in the way you needed it to be. If you're someone who struggled in the workplace because you didn't have worker protections, lawmakers need to hear those stories. They're hearing too often from corporate lobbyists and business interests. And we have that same right to organize and to lobby and to advocate for ourselves.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
Yeah, I think that is such an important point, because I know it can feel very daunting. Folks look at the makeup of the legislature, they see it's a supermajority, Republican supermajority. A lot of the folks who are in office, didn't face much opposition, right? So it's, it can feel daunting, but to your point, they are closer to us than the folks in Washington, D.C. Often they have more direct impact on, our day-to-day life, whether it's the roads we drive on or the schools we send our kids to. Uh, and because we have that closer relationship, sometimes we have more influence when we organize. And to your point, they are always going to be hearing from corporate lobbyists. Um, you can spot them when you're down in Montgomery. You can see them. I always like to look around and yeah, notice who is there when I am down there. And, they are going to hear from those folks. So it is important that they hear from everyday, regular people. Anyone who is listening, right? You have a right to contact your legislator, and you should contact your legislator and let them know how you feel. So we talked a little bit about some of the issue priorities, how that was decided, right? Some members have pushed for issues like expanding Medicaid, ending the state sales tax on groceries, which I should remind folks, Alabama is one of just a handful of states that still taxes groceries. As you mentioned, we rely on very regressive sales taxes that disproportionately impact poor and working folks. That's the revenue system we have in this state, and it's very, lopsided. But some of the other issues that Arise is going to be working on in the coming year, you alluded to paid parental leave. Also, universal school breakfast is another issue, as well as public education funding. So those are some big ones. Public transit is also another one. So were there any of those, particular issues that either I mentioned or I left out that you wanted to expand on a little bit as we move into the 2025 session?
Yeah, school breakfast, I'm so glad you mentioned that. Kids need to eat, and kids learn better when they have food to eat. There are a lot of misconceptions, I think, that some policymakers and even like regular voters have about free school meals. So one of the things we run into as we're advocating to expand school breakfast to all kids is this fear that, oh, if we give everyone free meals, what about the kids who should afford to pay for it? Why subsidize their food as well? Research shows that anytime you put a barrier in place to kids accessing free meals, kids are getting left out. So while the intention may be that we're going to make sure that those who can afford to pay do, the reality is that even kids whose parents, don't qualify for free meals currently, they're hungry at school because, hey, people forget to pay their bill.
Right. There's so many
Parents don't do the paperwork. Yeah.
So many different variables could come up there, just because your parent or parents have, a middle or upper income does not guarantee that you are actually benefiting from that at school every day in terms of lunch and breakfast. I mean, I think that's a really good point that you brought up.
And it's also a very efficient program. So with free school breakfast, which is what we're advocating for next year, we think it only will cost about $9 million additional resources to our education budget, which in the grand scheme of our budget is a very small amount. Kids who don't need free breakfast don't have to take it. There's a lot of grab and go items. One of the things I find really ironic about this is the legislature, when you're up there, they get free food at work all the time. I get free food at work. So I just find it bizarre that we would require kids to be in school for 8 hours a day and quibble over making sure that they have food while they're at school. Another issue you mentioned was education funding reform. And this is huge for equity. Actually, this is something that's been on Arise's agenda going back for more than 30 years. Alabama has extreme disparities in how we're funding education at the local level. We're over-reliant on local taxes, and as a result, kids in wealthy districts, have more resources than kids in low-income or, rural districts. So it's really important to pay attention to the discussion around our school funding formula. We are a part of a coalition with A+ that is looking at reforming how funds are distributed and shifting it to a need-based formula so that, instead of this hodgepodge kind of patchwork of funding approaches, There's a really clear formula that says that for kids in more high needs districts, the funds are going to be there to make sure that teachers and educators have what they need to support those students. You know, you also mentioned paid leave. This is an issue for all employees. I think any worker deserves to be able to take time away from work to care for their children or even other family members. And it's affecting our ability to recruit and retain state employees and teachers when we don't provide this. So those are just some of the key discussions that I know we're going to be having next year at the legislature.
Yes, absolutely, and definitely excited to see more momentum around paid parental leave. I think it's something that seems to be, in the consciousness a lot more than it used to be. When I first started in public education, over a decade ago, I was shocked that teachers did not get that as a benefit. It just seemed like something you would assume is in place. That if anyone would recognize it, it would be schools, right? Schools should know how important that is to the development of a child. But so I appreciate that, and that kind of leads me into my next question because paid parental leave is an issue that uh, any union folks will be familiar with. It's an issue that working people advocate around, and the mission of Alabama Arise is centered around better public policy for those marginalized by poverty. How does worker power intersect with this mission and the overall agenda? And maybe you can talk a little bit more about, what is worker power? What are we talking about there?
Yeah, I appreciate this question a lot. You know, when I started as a community organizer and I'd be out in community talking to folks about policy, I think there was this perception that the only solutions that progressives have on poverty are all government solutions, that it's all we need the government, a single payer health care, for example, or more safety net programs, subsidies for childcare, things like this. And those are important solutions to build a strong economy because the reality is that when those services are based on profit-driven industries, poor and working people always suffer and are always exploited. But that's only one part of the solution. And I think it's really critical that we also talk about the dignity of work and the importance of people having um, dignified work that pays fairly and recognizes the value of their labor, um, and that they have support whether they work inside the home or outside the home for other employers. So going back to the founding of Arise, one of the very first issues on our agenda was about helping people start employee ownership cooperatives. You know, that has always had to be a key part of the solution to building stronger communities. So to me, worker power is simply about I, as a worker who goes and gets a paycheck and relies on a paycheck to live my life, I should have certain dignity and protections in the workplace. If I work overtime, I should get paid for that. If I have unsafe working conditions, I should have a remedy for that. If I'm harassed in the workplace, I shouldn't have to put up with that. Because often in a state like Alabama, we hear this bootstrap narrative that the way out of poverty is work. And ideally, work would be your steps out of poverty, but there are too many people who are working really, really hard, demanding thankless jobs, and they're still struggling economically. So the solution to that has to be empowering workers to organize in the workplace, um, whether that's forming a union or having some sort of profit share in their workplace. That's empowering workers to fight for better wages. Alabama is one of those states that said, we're not going to allow localities to raise wages. Well, that's ridiculous. We should have the power to advocate at any level for better conditions in workplaces. So for us, worker power is a key part of giving people avenues out of poverty. And it's not that all businesses or companies are bad. There are just some bad actors who need regulation, and that's where government comes in and says, okay, we're not going to let you exploit people. We're not going to let you pay people less than a fair wage. Um, and we're not going to let you get away with abusing people or communities in the way that unfortunately Alabama has relied on historically to recruit industry. So I'm excited about efforts we've made to support the labor movement, especially in the last couple of years. It's really encouraging to see auto workers standing up at the Mercedes plant and other places and saying, we deserve the same type of union protection that workers in other parts of the country have, that workers in the Mercedes plants in Germany have. And, it takes a lot of bravery and courage for workers to be able to stand up. So we want to be out in communities with our members, with our churches, with our nonprofits, and saying, yeah, we think this is a good thing for communities. Too often the narrative and the business council narrative has been that, unions are somehow bad for the economy. We know that's not true. The evidence, the data proves that when workers have labor protections and when they are part of unions, their pay improves, companies do well, safety improves, and it doesn't have to be an either or. It can be a both and. Workers can succeed and, industry can succeed as well.
Right. I mean, I think you can look at the UAW as a good example. Ford and General Motors, they're doing quite well for themselves, right? But we know that an auto worker at Ford is going to be paid more than an auto worker at Hyundai, more than likely. Or even if Hyundai catches up with the pay, right? The treatment is going to be different. The safety is going to be different. The respect and dignity on the job is different. So all of those are really, really important. And I appreciate you mentioning employee cooperatives. I think that is another under discussed route to improving conditions for working people. Obviously on this show, we are union partisans, and so our answer to most problems is to unionize. But we do think that worker cooperatives are a really, interesting and important way to keep wealth in our communities, the wealth that we are creating as regular working folks, to make sure that that's staying locally, staying in our communities. And to your point there, when when workers organize and when they get a pay raise, when they get better benefits, when they have better health care, that uplifts the entire community from the bottom up, because those workers are going to, there's a lot of benefits there to the broader economy, to folks who maybe aren't directly impacted, right? And on that note, and you mentioned this already a little bit, Arise has grown its coalition with organized labor in the last year or two in particular, both with new group members, new individual members. Could you just talk a little bit more about that, that effort to build these coalitions? And what's your message to union leaders and union members out there who are wondering, how is this relevant to them? Why should they pay attention to Alabama Arise?
Thanks, Adam. First, I want to acknowledge your leadership as a organizer at Arise. You've really helped us increase and grow this coalition. My message to any union member or union leader is that solidarity is more important now than ever. Nobody is going to succeed working alone. We know this when we go to the State House. We are in close coalition always with any of our partners who can stand with us on our issues. And we want to be that partner for working folks as well. One of the things I find most interesting as we are building these relationships with union leaders and members is how much of our agenda also resonates with union members. It's not just about policies that are attacking labor that matter. It's kitchen table issues that affect everyday working class people. It's groceries that cost too much. Why is that? And why is our state taxing food? It's we can't afford childcare. So we've either got to pressure our, employers to provide more childcare support, or most likely we also need government to come in with investment because we know that a lot of these industries are not going to be, accessible and affordable without government subsidies. And in fact, a lot of, industries do benefit from subsidies. So why not subsidize things that help workers as well? I've been really encouraged to see, the leadership of the UAW, of mine workers, of all the organized labor that has stood strong and said we're not going to stand for, less than we're worth, less than we deserve. And so my message would just be, Arise is with you 100%. We invite you to join us and tell us what you need to see. We hope in the coming years to highlight worker power as a key plank on our agenda. Because, like I said earlier, the message has to be we're not going to solve poverty, we're not going to address inequity in our country if we can't address the plight of workers.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we wrap up here, I did want to make sure we address one specific issue that I know Arise and other partners will be working on, which is you talked about the incentives. There was a bill that several of us were pushing this past year that would strip state tax incentives from companies that violate child labor laws. Uh, is is that something that we anticipate coming back up this year? And what are you thinking on that particular issue? Because as an organizer, I see it as a very helpful issue to talk about a lot of things in our state. Both the scourge of child labor that we've seen, the lawlessness we've seen in that realm, but also, as you mentioned, the way the state has provided these massive subsidies to corporations.
Yeah, we're going to continue to fight the fight on tax incentives. This is an area of policy that I think is often invisible. What our government does and what, corporations do very successfully is they go in and advocate for tax breaks for major industries. So there are whole companies that are paying less in taxes than you as an individual worker or employee of that company are paying. So we're shifting the burden of paying for common public goods like the interstates, the highways, the bridges that these companies use to ship their products. We're paying for those as everyday workers, and companies are not paying. So we did increase penalties for child labor last year through SB 119. That was one success, but we have more work to do to tell that story. When people who are in the supply chain for Hyundai are employing 12-year-old undocumented Guatemalan kids, and some of those kids are literally dying or facing really unsafe working conditions. It's unacceptable that we've given millions and millions of our money to that company. In theory, we're bringing them here to support public good and to create better jobs and to make good cars. So we have to have that accountability if we're going to be spending our resources and state dollars. And I encourage you to, check out our State of Working Alabama report. I know you have talked about this on the show before, where we track some of the subsidies that we've given away to the auto industry over the past 30 years. We really need to be asking, what are we getting in return? And we have a right to ask for accountability. Every time we have to justify the expenditures that we're asking for on, say, food for kids or Medicaid. So we think that corporations that are benefiting from these tax expenditures also need to justify what they're doing. And we have to draw a line in the sand. It is unacceptable to rely on child labor. It's unacceptable to have some of the unsafe working conditions, and for that matter, discriminatory workplaces that exist in some of these industries. Um, they told us that the prosperity would be more broadly shared, that, bringing these industries to our state would help bring people out of poverty. And at its best, that's what good workplaces can do. They can help folks, have access to opportunity and a better life for themselves and their kids. So we just want to hold them accountable to what they said was going to happen when we gave our tax dollars to these companies.
Was there anything else, Robyn, as we wrap up, that you wanted to leave folks with, and of course, share where and how folks can get involved?
Sure. So I would invite you to join Alabama Arise if you are in Alabama and you're not already a member. Just visit us online at alarise.org, or reach out to one of our organizers like Adam, who's in your local community. We're happy to come out and like, educate folks on what's coming up at the legislature and how you can engage locally. If you're not in Alabama, I will say we're a part of networks of other groups like Arise that exist all over the country. So we're a part of the EARN network, Economic Analysis Research Network, that has, worker power and racial justice orgs across the country. And the State Priorities Partnership, which are partners who all work on tax and budget equity in almost every state. The other thing I would say is it can become incredibly overwhelming as people look ahead to what's happening in Congress, what the Trump administration might bring. We're anticipating immediately an expansion of the Trump tax cuts, which we know are not good for us. These tax cuts are not for us. They're for the wealthy and corporations who, frankly, don't need more tax cuts. So we're going to be waging that fight at the federal level as well as we look ahead to 2025. But connect with an organization. I mean, the thing is, we're all stronger when we stand together. So whether that's connecting with your local union, connecting with an organization like Arise, or joining another organization, we need members to stand together. And tell us how we can stand in solidarity with you, because we're here to support local communities in building power.
All right. Thank you so much, Robyn. We really appreciate it. And again, you can go to alarise.org if you want to find out more. Robyn, thanks for joining.
Thank you, Adam and Jacob. Have a good morning.
Yeah, thanks, Robyn. You too. You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.